Hey there everybody, I'm Joe the Disney Guy and welcome to another Disney Guy review. Well, it's the start of a new era, the Transitional Era, and it's time to see how the studio got along without their fearless leader, Walt Disney, by first taking a look at the story of everybody's favorite outlaw, Robin Hood. The story behind Robin Hood actually starts way back in the 1930s, when Walt Disney was starting to compile stories to turn into animated films following the success of Snow White. Yep, that's right, we're starting the first era without Walt by talking about Walt. Just because the guy was gone doesn't mean he wasn't still an integral part of the stories of how these movies got made, so don't be surprised to see his name continue to pop up every now and again. A story that had always interested Walt was the story of Reynard the Fox, a fable from Alsace-Lorraine. Reynard was a trickster of sorts, but it was his greatest character trait that was also the biggest flaw when it came to Disney adapting the story into an animated film. Aside from the fact that the fables surrounding Reynard tended to be extremely violent, Walt just never felt that it would be right to make a movie where the hero of the story was also essentially a crook. It's an interesting dynamic, really, because the violence of the story wasn't really a factor because, let's be honest, most of the stories that Disney movies are based off of are pretty violent. But the fact that Reynard was a character who defied authority when Disney much preferred his movies to be family-friendly and have a message was really a pretty strong juxtaposition. And it's that desire to have the main characters be role models that really hampered a movie about Reynard the Fox from ever being made. But although Walt had basically canned the idea of a Reynard the Fox movie, concept artist Ken Anderson was always taken with the idea, and tended to play with the story numerous times throughout the years. Despite several attempts to get the project off the ground ending in failure, Anderson again brought up the idea of Reynard in 1968, when the studio was beginning to look for new ideas for future films following The Jungle Book. This time, though, instead of telling the story of Reynard, Anderson suggested taking the characters from the fable and adapting them into the much more well-known story of Robin Hood. Wolfgang Reitherman, who had essentially taken over as Walt's successor, approved of the idea, as did the rest of the crew, and production on Robin Hood began. Unfortunately, the production of Robin Hood had major problems looming over it before it ever truly began. After Walt's death in 1966, the company was in a state of turmoil, and with the loss of their leader compounded with the uncertainty from stockholders about the future of the company and the impending opening of Walt Disney World, the studio was once again in some dire financial straits. Then, in 1971, Walt's brother, Roy, died of a stroke, leaving the company in the hands of Don Tatum and Card Walker, the first non-Disneys to be the head of the Disney company. So why is all this important to the production of Robin Hood? Well, with all the changes flying around, once again the Disney studio found themselves in a place where their next film really had to be a financial success. The only difference this time was they didn't have the guidance or instincts of Walt to lead them. The first steps to adapt the Reynard fable into Robin Hood was to create the characters, and Ken Anderson did just that, creating a cast of anthropomorphic animals to play the parts of Robin Hood. Unfortunately, it was in these designs where some trouble and disagreement popped up. Anderson wanted to experiment with making different, non-traditional animals into villains, for example making the evil Sheriff of Nottingham a goat. But Reitherman overruled Anderson and elected to make the Sheriff a wolf, a much more traditional animal villain. And herein lies the major struggle in this film. Because there was so much riding on the success of this movie, Reitherman elected to pretty much play things safe, a concept we also saw in Aristocats. And it's hard to blame him really when the fate of the animation department was hanging so precariously in the balance. Of course, not everyone was a fan of this play it safe approach, as it's said that Ken Anderson actually wept when he saw that his unique and creative character designs had essentially become stereotypes in the final production. The blending of the two stories continued into the plot, as some elements from the Reynard fable, such as stealing Prince John's treasure, was merged with the more traditional elements of the tales of Robin Hood, such as the archery tournament. The ending of the film, however, was a bit more problematic, as the original storyboard saw a bit darker of a setup before the final payoff, but was eventually streamlined into a more lighthearted and faster finish. So I mentioned earlier how the character of Reynard was too immoral to make a movie out of, yet we're using some of his exploits in this movie, so what gives? Well, you see, by making your main character a kind and good-hearted bandit who's duping a cowardly and evil prince, all of a sudden those immoral actions start to take on a more noble perception. It's a very subtle change, but in my opinion quite a brilliant one, because it allows you to tell the story without making your main character look bad. In the animation department, a lot of animation was repurposed from previous films, more than any Disney film at the time, in an effort to save both money and time, as the film was given a very small budget in comparison to earlier animated films. Sequences, movements, costumes, and even some character designs were brought over with slightly new aesthetics in an effort to make the older footage seem new again. And speaking of making old new again, some of the same voice actors were also brought in to reprise very similar roles. For example, Phil Harris returning to play a bear, and Barbara Luddy playing a matronly figure. But in addition to these returning voices, some new ones were brought in as well, with stage actor Brian Bedford voicing Robin Hood, famed British actor Peter Ustinov voicing Prince John, and country singer Roger Miller voicing Alan Adale. One of the more interesting decisions during production was the blending of the cast. There's a distinct mix of both British and American voices, which is fine and all, but the jump from the proper sounding Brian Bedford to, say, the more twangy sounding Pat Buttram, who played the Sheriff of Nottingham, could be quite jarring at times. The music was handled a bit differently than in the last few Disney features, as the Sherman Brothers weren't used at all to write any of the songs in the film. Instead, Roger Miller wrote the 3 songs sung by his character, Whistle Stop, Oodalolly, and Not in Nottingham. Acclaimed lyricist Johnny Mercer wrote The Phony King of England, and Disney mainstays Floyd Huddleston and George Bruns wrote Love. It's definitely different to be using so many different songwriters for one project, but I thought, at least with Roger Miller, it was an interesting approach by Disney and something that we've only sort of seen before with, say, like Peggy Lee and Lady and the Tramp, to allow the person singing the song to also write the songs. I think it definitely adds a more authentic and natural vibe to the singer in the song. And despite the limited budget, Robin Hood managed to hit theaters on November 8th, 1973.
But be a stout-hearted little lad and don't let it get you down.
Gee whiz, it's Robin Hood!
Happy birthday, son!
Robin Hood was the first Disney animated feature to not be worked on or approved by Walt in any way, shape, or form. So how does it match up with previous Disney features? Well, first things first, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that's the abundance of reused assets in animation, because there is a lot of that in this film. We've seen Disney movies with some animation repeating throughout the film, and we've even seen a fair share of animation recycled from previous films, but never to this extent. To give you just a snapshot of this, look at the scene in the forest after the archery competition. In that sequence alone, there's scenes from the Aristocats, the Jungle Book, and even Snow White. But while the recycled animation, for me at least, is very noticeable, I think it's the reuse of character assets that really bothers me more. Robin Hood is clearly wearing Peter Pan's costume, Sir Hiss is a virtual remake of Kaa from Jungle Book, and look, I love Phil Harris as much as the next guy, and I love Baloo and Thomas O'Malley, but for the third straight film, he's basically playing the same character, which feels sort of, dare I say, lazy. Now we know why stuff like this was going on, but that doesn't make it immune to criticism, at least not to me anyway. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment here. In fairness, something like recycled animation I think is more noticeable to a modern audience than it was to one in 1973. Remember, home video wasn't a thing back then, so even though it may feel blasphemous to be copying from Snow White, someone may have only seen Snow White maybe 5 times by 1973, so the recycled animation probably wasn't as blatant to the audience back then. Now this doesn't excuse them from pretty much copying and pasting the character of Baloo, but it does at least mildly explain why there was so much recycling going on. The other thing that bothered me about the film was that the plot was very thin, but I felt like it didn't have to be. There are little teases of some depth, both in the story and characters, that were briefly addressed, but never fully explored. The 2 biggest examples of this I can think of were Robin Hood wondering whether Maid Marian still remembered and loved him, and Little John and Robin Hood discussing whether or not they were the bad guys. These were both plot points and character development that I would have wanted to see explored a little more, but instead what we got was pretty much a safe and more action-based retelling of the Robin Hood story. Unfortunately, the lack of exploration of these plot points in particular ultimately led to Maid Marian effectively being a useless character, and it took away a lot of the depth from the Robin Hood character. And it could have been so simple too. Imagine for a moment, instead of just seeing the townspeople's despair being in jail, we saw the realization of Robin Hood that it was his bravado that put his friends into this situation, and questioning whether or not toying with Prince John was really the right thing to do. I think it would have added a lot of depth to the character and made him more well-rounded and ultimately heroic. But as often seems the case, though it appears like I'm tearing into this movie, I actually do enjoy Robin Hood quite a bit whenever I watch it, even if I do think the movie has some flaws. Why is that? Well, part of it is nostalgia, as this was one of the few movies that my grandparents had at their house that I didn't growing up, so watching it always takes me back to when I was a kid visiting my grandparents. But nostalgia aside, I do enjoy the characters in this movie as well. Even though I would have liked to have seen more depth, I do still really like the character of Robin Hood. He's the definition of cool, no matter the situation. And something about that nonchalant confidence just plays well with me. And I gotta give credit to the villains in this movie as well. Prince John may be a bit of a coward, but at least he's an entertaining coward. And he does manage to wield his authority in enough of a vicious way that it still makes him threatening. But for as much fun as I have with Prince John, the Sheriff of Nottingham is just a jerk. He's easily the most unlikable character in this film, but it's that unlikability that makes him such a dastardly villain. I mean, come on, have you ever hated a character as much as when the sheriff took away that kid's birthday coin? But for as bad as the sheriff is, I gotta say, Prince John may have one of my favorite lines from a Disney villain ever.
I sentence you to sudden, instant, and even immediate death.
I don't know whether to laugh or be terrified, but that is awesome. And aside from just the characters, the score in this film is fantastic, the action is fun to watch, and the movie is actually pretty funny at times. So, yeah, does Robin Hood have some flaws? Absolutely, it's far from a perfect film, but it's still a highly entertaining one, and one that I always find myself enjoying watching. Critics weren't all too kind to Robin Hood upon its release. Many were critical of what they felt was average animation, as well as one-dimensional characters and a rough plot. Luckily though, moviegoers seemed to disagree with the critics, as the film, which was only allotted a $1.5 million budget, managed to bring in $9.5 million in its initial release. It's interesting to wonder what Walt would have thought of this. On the one hand, we know that he really wanted his movies to be critical successes. But I don't think he would have been too upset with a crowd pleaser that brought in some money. The film was only re-released once, in 1982, and it was actually a nominee to be on the American Film Institute's Top 10 Animated Films list. But though the film and its characters have received some notoriety over the years, it's actually the songs of the film that have gone on to a greater legacy. The Whistle Stop would be sampled and repurposed in the 2000 dance song, The Hamster Dance. Ooda Lolly recently appeared in a commercial in 2015 for Android, and Love was not only nominated for an Oscar for Best Song in 1974, but also appeared in the 2009 movie The Fantastic Mr. Fox. So in the end, although Robin Hood may not stand up to some of Disney's earlier films in terms of quality or legacy, it's still a vitally important part of Disney history, and a movie that has entertained audiences for over 40 years. Well everybody, that about wraps up for me this week. Hope y'all enjoyed, and let me know what your thoughts are on Robin Hood. Also be sure to subscribe to my channel and check out my last video, my next video, and as always, the Disney Guy Review playlist. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter for any news with myself and the channel, and I'll be sure to see you all real soon.
John, that phony king of England, yeah.